Are you really going to leave your own child in Times Square and drive away? He whispered, trembling. And all I could do was smile. This morning, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. 42 missed calls from an unknown number. A Pennsylvania area code blinking like a warning light on my screen. For a second, I thought my heart might stop beating. I froze right there in my studio apartment in Brooklyn, paintbrush in hand, colors dripping onto the hardwood floor, staring at my phone like it was a loaded gun. I'm Rachel Collins, 31, digital artist. I've spent the last 20 years trying to bury the girl I used to be under layers of art, independence, and carefully controlled silence. And yet, here I was, one phone call away from being 12 years old all over again. I could almost taste the metal railings, feel the crush of people, hear the roar of horns and neon lights humming overhead. Times Square. The place where my parents once taught me exactly what love wasn't. Growing up in Clearwater, Ohio, everyone thought my family was perfect. People waved at my dad, Stephen Collins, whenever he drove by in his gleaming red pickup with his name painted across the door. Collins Auto Repair. He had that wide grin and booming voice that made everyone feel like his best friend. Mom Laura Collins owned Laura's Pie House, the place locals swore made the best blueberry pie in the county. Her hair always curled perfectly. Her perfume smelled like vanilla and butter. From the outside, we were the American dream. But behind our white-painted front door, the air turned sharp and heavy as motor oil. My dad's smile vanished the second he kicked off his boots. And my mom, well, she became someone I didn't recognize at all. At church, people whispered how lucky I was to have parents like mine. They didn't know how my father's voice could turn the walls into cages, how the kitchen table felt like a courtroom where I was always the defendant. My brother, Kyle Collins, 4 years older than me, was the town's golden boy, quarterback, straight A's, Dad's pride and joy. The sun might as well have risen and set for Kyle. For me, it was different. I once brought home a 98 on a math test. Dad looked at me like I'd dropped a bomb on his living room. Where's the other 2 points? Rachel, do you want to be average? Is that who you are? Mom chimed in, slicing apples for her famous pies. Don't start crying. Your father just wants you to try harder. You know how the world is for girls who can't keep up. But nothing could have prepared me for the day they decided to teach me a lesson about being independent. Every time the phone rings unexpectedly, I'm right back there, standing in the middle of Times Square, choking on exhaust fumes and fear, waiting for parents who would never come back. On Sunday mornings, the sun streamed through the stained glass windows at Clearwater Baptist, painting my parents in holy colors as they held hands in the front pew. People smiled at us like we were the postcard family. The Collinses, steady, respectable, admired. Dad shook hands with everyone, laughing so loud that even the pastor paused mid-sermon sometimes. He'd slap men on the back, call women ma'am in that deep voice that made people trust him instantly. Mom carried plates of her award-winning pies to bake sales and charity drives, beaming as folks praised her flaky crusts and sweet filling. "You're blessed, Rachel," they'd say. "Your mama's got a gift." But blessings have sharp edges, because behind those church doors, the second our front door shut, the laughter curdled, Dad's boots thumped across the floor like warning shots. He'd drop his keys into the ceramic dish so hard it sometimes cracked. Then his voice would slice through the house. "Where's my dinner? What the hell's this mess on the counter?" If the garage had been busy, if a customer complained about a bill, it was my fault somehow. And Mom, my soft-spoken mother with her perfectly coiffed hair, would slip into the role of peacemaker, Except instead of protecting me, she'd say, "Stephen, she's just a kid." Then glance at me with eyes that pleaded, "Don't make this worse." She'd scrub the same countertop over and over, like maybe if she cleaned enough. Dad wouldn't explode, but explosions came anyway. One evening, Dad hurled my report card across the room. 98 Kyle would have gotten 100. Mom wiped flour off her hands and murmured, "You know how your father is? Don't disappoint him." My brother, Kyle, seemed to walk through life surrounded by a golden spotlight. He'd breeze through the door, football helmet under his arm, grin wide. Dad's eyes would light up. There's my boy. Meanwhile, if I so much as coughed too loud, Dad barked, "Can you be quiet for one goddamn minute?" Kyle wasn't cruel. He was just absent, floating above it all. When Dad screamed, Kyle vanished into his room, headphones on, leaving me to face the shrapnel alone. Once, on my 10th birthday, Mom promised I could invite friends over for a small party. I helped her bake cupcakes, even frosted them myself. The morning of the party, Dad slammed his coffee cup on the table and said, "Change of plans. We're going to Cleveland." Mom acted like it was a fun surprise. "We'll make a day of it." But instead, they drove me to a giant mall, handed me a $20 bill, and told me, "Don't wander too far. We'll pick you up in 5 hours." I remember sitting on a hard bench outside the food court, clutching that 20, too scared to spend a dime, watching other families laugh together as they shared pizza and ice cream. When they finally showed up late, "Of course," Mom chirped. "See, you did fine on your own." I'd never felt so small. Everyone in Clearwater believed my parents were saints. But I knew better. I'd seen the cracks in their smiles, the way Dad's eyes went cold, the way Mom's voice dropped to a hiss when she thought no one else could hear. Sometimes I'd stare at my reflection and wonder, is it me? Is something wrong with me that makes them like this? At night, I'd bury myself in drawing, sketching other worlds where parents stayed gentle, where little girls weren't told they were never enough. But no matter how many beautiful places I created on paper, I couldn't draw my way out of Clearwater. Not yet. The winter I turned 11. The snow came early and thick in Clearwater. It blanketed the streets like icing on one of Mom's pies, hiding the dirt underneath. But no matter how pretty it looked, inside our house, the storm raged year-round. It started one Friday night. Dad came home late from the garage, the smell of whiskey wafting off his jacket. His eyes were bloodshot, his voice too calm. That was always the scariest part when he spoke softly, dragging out his words like he was savoring the fear. He dropped into his recliner, staring at me across the living room. "You know what your problem is, Rachel? You think life owes you something?" Mom hovered behind him, pressing a dish towel between her hands so hard her knuckles went white. I shook my head, whispering, "No, sir." "Oh, don't play innocent." Dad leaned forward, the leather chair creaking under his weight. "Kids these days are soft, weak. You need to learn to stand on your own 2 feet. Mom chimed in, voice trembling. "Stephen, it's late. Maybe we can talk about this tomorrow." But tomorrow never saved me. The next day, they announced we were going for a drive. Mom packed sandwiches and Dad acted like the night before never happened, cracking jokes and singing along with the radio. That was his pattern, a sudden calm, pretending everything was normal, as if the storm inside him had simply blown past. We ended up outside a grocery store on the edge of town. I thought maybe they'd changed their minds about that art set I'd been begging for. But instead, as I reached for Mom's hand, she pulled away. "Stay here," she said, her voice sharp. "Don't move. We'll be back in 15 minutes. I blinked, confused. "Can I come with you?" Dad scoffed. God, Rachel, you're not a baby. 15 minutes turned into an hour. I stood by the automatic doors, watching carts squeak past, my breath puffing white in the freezing air. My fingers were numb. Every time the doors whooshed open, I flinched, hoping it was them. An elderly cashier finally asked, "Sweetheart, are you lost?" I shook my head so hard my teeth rattled. When Mom and Dad returned, Dad laughed as he patted my shoulder. "See, you survived. That's how you toughen up a kid." Mom leaned closer and whispered, "Don't tell anyone. People won't understand our family." It wasn't the first time. The worst was my 11th birthday. Mom had promised a sleepover. I'd invited 3 girls from school. We made plans for movies, popcorn, pillow forts. The night before, I helped Mom hang streamers. She even let me taste the frosting for my cake. I thought maybe things were finally changing. But the next morning, Dad marched into my room, eyes blazing. "No party." He barked. "You think you deserve a celebration for breathing? We're not raising a spoiled brat." He locked my bedroom door from the outside. I sat on my bed, listening to the sound of girls' voices and laughter floating in from the backyard. I could smell the barbecue, hear Kyle shouting as he played catch with his friends. But I wasn't allowed to join. When Dad finally unlocked the door that night, I stepped into the hallway, my legs trembling. Mom stood there with a forced smile. "Happy birthday, honey," she said, handing me a slice of cake on a paper plate. The pink frosting was smeared, half melted. I stared at it, my throat too tight to swallow. Later, alone in my room, I drew for hours, sketching a little girl blowing out candles surrounded by parents who actually wanted her there. But paper wasn't strong enough to hold back the hurt. And every new wound only built higher the wall between me and the people who were supposed to love me most. The day they left me in Times Square was crisp and bright, the sky so blue it hurt my eyes. It was October, the city buzzing with tourists wrapped in scarves and clutching shopping bags. I remember thinking how big everything felt, like the skyscrapers might topple over and crush me if I looked up too long. Dad was in an unusually good mood that morning. He ruffled my hair at breakfast, called me champ, like he sometimes did when he wanted to pretend he was the world's best father. Mom hummed as she packed sandwiches, wearing her favorite red coat. "We're going into the city," she said. "Just the 3 of us. A little adventure." I tried not to get too excited. I'd learned that hope was dangerous. But in the car, with classic rock blasting from the speakers, I let myself imagine we'd finally have a normal day. Maybe we'd see a Broadway show. Maybe we'd visit the Disney store like Dad promised. The traffic thickened as we crawled into Manhattan. Yellow cabs honked. Steam rose from the grates in ghostly plumes. Dad pointed at billboards, making jokes. Mom quizzed me on state capitals. By the time we pulled into a garage near Times Square, my stomach was fluttering. We stepped out into a river of people. Neon lights flashed everywhere. The air smelled like roasted peanuts and exhaust. I stared up at the giant screens playing music videos and felt tiny. Dad leaned down, gripping my shoulders. "Stay right here by the big red steps." "Rachel, understand?" Mom chimed in. "We're going to grab food and find better parking. 15 minutes. Don't move." I blinked, already uneasy. "Can I come with you?" Dad's jaw tightened. "Don't start, Rachel. You're 12. You're old enough to handle yourself for 15 damn minutes." Mom gave me that tight-lipped smile. "You'll be fine, sweetheart." This is how kids learn independence. They turned and disappeared into the crowd. I stood there, crushed between camera-toting tourists and people in cartoon costumes trying to hustle tips. 15 minutes passed, then 30, then an hour. I stared at the digital clocks flashing above the theaters, willing the minutes backward. The sun slipped lower, shadows growing longer across the sidewalk. My feet hurt. My hands were freezing. I tried to swallow the knot in my throat. A man dressed as Spider-Man leaned close and whispered, "Smile for a photo, kid?" I flinched away, clutching my small purse to my chest. People swirled around me, laughing, yelling. The city felt like a monster with 1,000 faces. None of them looking at me long enough to see I was disappearing. At one point, I saw a glimpse of Dad's red jacket across the avenue. My heart leapt. I ran to the curb, waving both arms. He turned, smirked, then lifted his hand in a mock wave. Mom leaned out from behind him, eyes glittering. She called across the traffic, "Let's see how you find your way home." Dad laughed. Not a real laugh. A cruel, hollow bark that echoed off glass and concrete. Then they turned away, vanishing into the crowd as if they'd never been there at all. My chest squeezed so tight I couldn't breathe. I stumbled back toward the red steps, bumping into strangers who cursed me under their breath. I felt weightless, like I might float up into the blinking signs and never come down. I had $12 in my pocket. No cell phone, no ID except my library card from Clearwater, and no idea how to get home. For hours. I drifted through Times Square in circles, every corner looking the same. The lights blurred into rivers of color. My ears rang from horns and music. At some point, my knees gave out. I sank down near the TKTS booth, burying my face in my arms, trying to disappear. A voice cut through the chaos. "Sweetheart, are you lost?" I looked up into the kind eyes of a woman in an MTA uniform. Her name tag read, Gloria Thompson. She looked like someone's grandma, with silver hair pulled into a bun and red glasses perched low on her nose. I tried to lie. My parents went to park the car. Gloria shook her head slowly. "Honey, you've been here a long time. Let's go somewhere quiet and talk." The warmth in her voice cracked the dam inside me. Words poured out between sobs. Gloria called the police. Soon. I was sitting in the back of a cruiser, wrapped in a scratchy blanket. Lights flashing blue against my cheeks as Times Square blared and pulsed around me. Somewhere deep inside, part of me still whispered, "They'll come back. They'll realize this was too far." But they never did. The chill of Times Square clung to me even after they took me away from the lights. At the precinct, fluorescent bulbs buzzed overhead, while an officer gently handed me a styrofoam cup of hot chocolate. My fingers shook so hard, I nearly spilled it. I remember staring into the swirl of cocoa and marshmallows, wishing I could dive in and never come back up. Hours passed in a blur of questions. "What are your parents' names? Where do they live? Do you have anyone we can call?" I could barely answer. My voice kept cracking like ice underfoot. A woman from New York's Department of Children and Family Services showed up. Her name was Elaine Porter. Mid-40s. Curly brown hair pulled into a tight ponytail. Eyes sharp and kind at the same time. "Rachel," she said, kneeling so we were eye level. "I know this is scary, but you're safe now. We're going to take care of you." The next hours were a whirlwind. Forms, phone calls, more questions. By midnight, I found myself riding in Elaine's car through silent streets. Lights blurring past the window like shooting stars. We pulled up outside a small brick house in Queens. The porch light glowed warm in the dark. "This is the Matthews family," Elaine said softly. "They've been fostering for 15 years. They're good people." Thomas Matthews opened the door. Early 40s, tall, wire-rimmed glasses, wearing paint-splattered jeans. His wife Emily stood beside him, petite, dark hair tucked into a messy bun, wearing scrubs. She smelled faintly of hand sanitizer and vanilla lotion. Thomas grinned. "Hey there. Rachel, heard you're an artist?" "Me too. You should see my studio," Emily said. "We've got a room ready for you, and a bathroom all to yourself." I blinked. My own bathroom. I spent my first night with the Matthewses in a room with pale blue walls, a soft quilt on the bed, and a small bookshelf lined with novels and sketch pads. I sat there, knees tucked to my chest, listening to the quiet hum of their dishwasher down the hall. I kept waiting for someone to scream, for the door to slam, but it never came. The next day, Elaine took me to a government building downtown for an emergency hearing. The room smelled like stale coffee and paper. A family court judge peered at me over his glasses. Stephen and Laura Collins arrived, looking immaculate as ever. Dad wore a suit and tie. Mom dabbed her eyes with a tissue, mascara perfectly intact. Their lawyer stood up. "Your Honor, my clients love their daughter. This was simply an attempt to teach her resilience." My father leaned forward. "Your Honor, we checked on her. From across the street. We wanted to see if she'd figure things out. Kids these days have no survival skills." Mom chimed in, voice trembling. "We didn't abandon her. We just wanted her to learn to be strong." Elaine cleared her throat. "Your Honor, Rachel was left alone in one of the busiest tourist hubs in America, with no money, no phone, and no way home. She was picked up by police after several hours, terrified and freezing." The judge's voice dropped. "This court doesn't call that parenting. It calls it child endangerment." Dad scoffed. "People are soft these days. We turned out fine, didn't we?" I couldn't help it. I finally spoke. My voice was shaking but clear. "I'm not fine. I don't want to go home." The words hung in the air, a silence so thick it felt alive. Mom gasped, hand pressed to her chest. "Rachel, how can you say that?" Dad glared at me like I was a stranger. "You're ungrateful." The judge banged his gavel. "For now, Rachel remains in foster care. We'll reconvene in 30 days. Stephen and Laura Collins left the room with their lawyer. Mom shot me one last desperate look. Dad didn't look back at all. Back at the Matthews house, Thomas set up an easel in the spare room and gave me a set of acrylic paints. "This is your space now," he said. "Paint anything you want." Emily made me hot cocoa every night. She'd gently ask if I wanted to talk. Sometimes I did. Mostly I didn't, but she always sat beside me anyway. Weeks turned into months. Court dates came and went. My parents refused to attend parenting classes. They insisted they'd done nothing wrong. At the final hearing, the judge stared at them over his glasses. "You've shown no remorse, no insight. The state finds you unfit. Unless you complete an intensive 2-year rehabilitation program, you will lose your parental rights." Dad crossed his arms. "We're not jumping through hoops for the state. We were just trying to raise our kid to survive." Mom sobbed into her tissue. The judge turned to me. "Rachel, do you want to go home with your parents?" I swallowed hard. "No, I want to stay with the Matthewses." Dad slammed his fist on the table. "You don't get to decide." The judge's voice was like steel. "Actually, she does." And just like that, the Collinses were no longer my legal parents. I remember sitting in that courtroom, feeling like a boat finally cut free from a sinking dock. 3 months later, Thomas and Emily Matthews sat me down at the kitchen table. Thomas cleared his throat. "We'd be honored if you'd let us adopt you, Rachel." Emily reached for my hand. "Only if you want to. No pressure. You deserve a family who chooses you." Tears filled my eyes. "Yes," I whispered, "I want you to be my family." And in that moment, for the first time in my life, I started to believe that maybe I belonged somewhere after all. Years drifted by like pages turning in a sketchbook, each one layering new colors over the gray tones of my childhood. I became Rachel Matthews, officially and completely. New name, new birth certificate, New start. Thomas encouraged me to pour my feelings into my art. I filled canvas after canvas with fierce brushstrokes, colors colliding, shapes clawing their way out of dark backgrounds. Emily, meanwhile, taught me how to breathe again, to sit quietly and let the world exist without feeling like it might crush me. High school was still a battlefield sometimes. I flinched at sudden noises. I'd vanish into the bathroom if someone raised their voice. But I found my tribe among the art kids, the ones who smelled like paint thinner and wore clothes splattered with color. After graduation, I moved to New York City, determined to build a life that was entirely mine. I enrolled at the School of Visual Arts, surrounded by towering buildings and neon lights that didn't scare me anymore. That's where I met Jasmine Lee. She was a whirlwind of neon hair and oversized hoodies, always talking with her hands, always sketching ideas on napkins and scraps of paper. The first time she critiqued one of my color palettes, I wanted to strangle her. But then she grinned and said, "You've got the steadiest line work I've ever seen. Like you're afraid to make mistakes. It's beautiful. But what happens if you let go?" I'd never met anyone like Jasmine. She was bold where I was cautious, loud where I was quiet. She pulled me out of my shell, but never forced me. We'd sit in cafes until 2 a.m, debating color theory and typography, our coffees growing cold. One snowy night, she confessed she liked girls. My stomach dropped because I realized, so did I. She leaned across the table and whispered, "So, you and me, is that a thing?" I couldn't speak, I just nodded. Being with Jasmine was like discovering a new shade of paint I'd never seen before. After college, we started a design studio together. Matthews Creative. We poured our souls into projects for nonprofits, kids' hospitals, women's shelters. I felt like I was finally doing something good with all the darkness I'd carried for so long. And then, my phone rang one quiet Tuesday morning. I was sitting in my sunlit studio, surrounded by sketches and color swatches. Jasmine was humming in the next room. 42 missed calls, Pennsylvania area code. I stared at the screen so long my vision blurred. My fingers hovered over the voicemail icon. When I finally pressed play, a voice I hadn't heard in nearly 20 years poured into my ears. "Hey, Rachel, it's Kyle. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but Dad's sick. Really sick. He had a massive heart attack last night. The doctors, they don't know if he's going to make it. I thought you should know. Call me if you want." I dropped the phone. Jasmine rushed in, grabbing my shoulders. "What happened, Rach? Breathe. Look at me. Breathe." I was gasping so hard I couldn't form words. My chest felt like it was caving in. For years, I'd convinced myself the past was dead and buried, but suddenly, it clawed its way up, dragging me back into a place I thought I'd escaped. I sat there on the floor, Jasmine's arms wrapped around me, wondering, do I owe them anything? And if I don't, why does it still hurt so damn much? The train ride back to Pennsylvania felt unreal, like I was floating through someone else's life. Jasmine offered to come with me, but I shook my head. I needed to do this on my own. Outside the hospital, the wind whipped my hair into my eyes, stinging tears I refused to let fall. Inside, antiseptics stung my nostrils. Machines beeped in quiet rhythms. Nurses moved like ghosts down the corridors. Kyle stood waiting in the cardiac ICU hallway. He looked older, shoulders hunched, eyes hollow. He tried to smile, but it crumbled halfway. "Thanks for coming," he murmured. I folded my arms across my chest. "Where's Mom?" "In the cafeteria. I thought maybe you'd want to see Dad alone first." He led me into a dim room where the smell of bleach and plastic was suffocating. My father lay there, tubes snaking from his arms, an oxygen line in his nose. He looked impossibly small. The man who'd once seemed 10 feet tall, now reduced to skin and bones beneath starched sheets. His eyes fluttered open. It took him a moment to focus on me. "Rachel," he croaked, voice rough as sandpaper. "It's Matthews now," I corrected, steady as I could. He swallowed hard. "I heard from Kyle. You look grown." I am... Silence thickened between us like concrete. "I never wanted all this," he whispered. "I thought I was making you strong." My breath shuddered out. "You left me alone in Times Square. Dad. You drove away laughing. You didn't make me strong. You made me terrified." His eyes shone with something like shame. "Your mother and I, we didn't know better. That's how my father raised me. You toughen kids up. Make them survive." I clenched my fists so tight my nails bit into my palms. "You know what's funny? I did survive. But not because of you. In spite of you." He blinked rapidly, chest hitching as he tried to breathe. "I think about you every day. I wish I'd been different." The machine beside him beeped faster. An alarm slicing through the room. A nurse rushed in, checked his vitals, adjusted something. "You have to go," she said firmly. "He needs rest." I backed away, pulse pounding in my ears. As I reached the door, he rasped out, "Rachel, I'm sorry." I paused but didn't turn back. Kyle was waiting in the hallway. He shifted from foot to foot, unable to meet my eyes. "Mom's been a wreck," he murmured. "She wants to see you." I exhaled shakily. "Fine. Let's get this over with." We found her sitting alone at a cafeteria table, coffee cooling in front of her. Her hair was still styled, makeup perfect, but there were dark circles under her eyes. When she saw me, she gasped like she'd seen a ghost. "Rachel," she whispered. "Matthews," I corrected. Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I've missed you every day." I felt the walls closing in, the cafeteria lights glaring too bright. "Don't," I snapped. "Don't say you missed me. You're the one who left me there. You chose him over me, again and again." She reached for my hand, but I jerked away. "We were trying to make you strong," she insisted, voice trembling. "You were too sensitive. You needed to learn how cruel the world is." I already knew. I shot back. "I lived with you." Kyle stepped between us, hands raised. "Please, both of you, just stop." Mom sank back into her chair, shoulders shaking. I thought you'd come back someday, that we'd start over." I stared at her, feeling old and tired. "I did start over, just not with you." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. "I'm not angry anymore," I said softly. "But I don't forgive you, and I don't want you in my life." Her face crumpled. "Rachel, please. We're still your parents." "No, you're not." I turned away, my heart thudding so hard it felt like it might crack my ribs. As I reached the door, Kyle's voice followed me. "Rach, I'm sorry too, for not standing up for you, for believing them." I glanced over my shoulder. "You were a kid. Kyle, so was I." He swallowed. "Is there any chance we could stay in touch?" I thought about Jasmine, about Thomas and Emily, about the life I'd built piece by piece. "Maybe," I said, "but not right now." I walked out of the hospital into the biting wind, my breath fogging the air. For the first time in years, the cold didn't scare me. I wasn't the girl they'd left behind anymore. I was Rachel Matthews, and I was finally free. The train back to New York rolled through darkness, city lights flickering past the windows like stars caught in a fast current. I rested my forehead against the glass, feeling the thrum of the tracks under my bones. All my life, I thought survival meant being invisible, keeping quiet, shrinking myself small enough to fit into spaces other people demanded. But sitting there, watching the skyline grow closer, I realized something simple and fierce. Survival isn't about hiding. It's about refusing to let other people write your story. I used to believe I was broken because of what my parents did. But I'm not broken. I'm scarred. And scars mean you healed. Thomas and Emily taught me that family isn't always the people who share your blood. Sometimes it's the people who choose you, who stay when things get messy, who remind you that you deserve gentle love. Jasmine showed me it's okay to be vulnerable, that letting someone in doesn't mean surrendering your power. And even Kyle, in his hesitant, awkward way, reminded me that sometimes people grow, even if it takes them years. I've learned boundaries are not cruel. They're necessary. And forgiveness isn't mandatory, it's optional. Some days, the memories still reach out like cold hands trying to pull me under. But I have anchors now. A studio filled with color. A partner who sees me. A name that belongs only to me. So if you're listening to this and thinking you'll never escape the shadows cast over your childhood, hear me. You can build your own light. Your past doesn't define your future. Your worth isn't determined by the people who hurt you. And you don't owe anyone your silence or your forgiveness just because they share your DNA. Have you ever had to choose between your peace and your past? Have you ever walked away from the people who should have loved you most? I'd love to hear your story. Drop a comment below. And remember, choosing yourself isn't selfish. It's survival. And sometimes it's the first step toward truly living.